When did you realize you were living with a supervillain? I was taking out the trash when I noticed Mrs. Curtis from next door struggling with a heavy garbage bag. She kept looking over her shoulder, and when she saw me watching, she forced a smile and quickly shoved the bag into the bin. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that her teenage son, Cooper, who used to play basketball in their driveway, had completely disappeared. I didn't join the dots until the smell started about a month later. It was faint at first and came from their backyard. I figured her dog had dragged something dead into the garden, but the smell got worse and attracted flies. Other neighbors started complaining, but Mrs. Curtis insisted it was just fertilizer for her roses. Then packages started arriving daily at her house. Heavy boxes that delivery drivers struggled to carry. She would meet them at the door and immediately take the packages inside, never letting anyone see what was in them. The delivery trucks came from industrial supply companies, which seemed odd for a suburban neighborhood. One night I couldn't sleep and saw lights on in her basement. Through the small window I could see her moving around down there. She appeared to be digging, which made no sense. I watched for a while until she suddenly looked up at the window, and I ducked away. The next day, she knocked on my door with a plate of cookies. She was overly friendly and kept mentioning how she valued good neighbors who minded their own business. The cookies tasted strange, so I threw them out after she left. That night, I felt dizzy and nauseous, even though I'd only eaten one bite. I started documenting everything in a notebook. The late-night digging sounds. The chemical smell that burned my nose when the wind blew from her yard. The fact that I hadn't seen her husband in 2 months, even though his car was still in the driveway. Something was very wrong at the Curtis house. The breaking point came when I saw her dragging something heavy across her backyard in the middle of the night. It was wrapped in a tarp, but shaped distinctly like a body. She pulled it toward the shed where she kept gardening supplies. I couldn't call the police with no real evidence, so I waited until morning. When she left for work, I jumped the fence into her backyard. The shed was locked, but through a crack, I could see multiple tarps piled inside. The smell was overwhelming and definitely not fertilizer. My hands were shaking as I took photos with my phone. I needed proof before making accusations. That evening, she knocked on my door again. This time, she wasn't smiling. She said she'd noticed footprints in her yard and her security camera had malfunctioned. She stared at me intently and mentioned how dangerous the neighborhood had become, how people could disappear without anyone noticing. I assured her I hadn't seen anything unusual and locked my door with the deadbolt, but I could feel her standing outside for several minutes before finally leaving. That night, I uploaded all my photos and notes to cloud storage and shared them with my brother who lived across town just in case. The next morning, there were police cars everywhere. Officers were carrying evidence bags out of the Curtis house while she sat in the back of a squad car. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk whispering about what they'd found. The word bodies kept coming up, but nobody knew the full story yet. A detective approached me since I lived next door. He asked if I'd noticed anything suspicious lately. I handed over my notebook and showed him the photos on my phone. He looked grim as he flipped through everything I'd documented. He said they'd received an anonymous tip about unusual chemical purchases. As they continued searching the house, an officer came running out looking pale. He whispered urgently to the detective, who immediately called for more backup. Whatever they'd found in that basement was worse than anyone imagined. The entire block was evacuated while hazmat teams arrived. Later that evening, the detective returned to take my full statement. He couldn't reveal details of the investigation, but thanked me for the documentation. He mentioned they'd found multiple bodies in various stages of decomposition, but what disturbed him most was what they'd discovered in the basement. She wasn't just hiding bodies, he said quietly. She was experimenting on them. We found medical equipment and journals describing procedures I can't even repeat. I felt sick, thinking about all those cookies she'd brought over, all those friendly conversations where she'd smiled and asked about my family. As I watched them remove evidence bags late into the night, one question haunted me. They'd found her husband's body, and several others I didn't recognize, but they still hadn't found Cooper, her son, who'd supposedly gone to stay with relatives months ago. The detective had asked me to call if I remembered any details about when I'd last seen the boy, but the truth was I couldn't remember. It felt like he'd simply vanished one day, and we'd all accepted Mrs. Curtis's explanation without question. That's when I remembered something. The last day I'd seen Cooper, he'd been helping his mother carry one of those heavy packages inside. He'd looked scared and kept glancing at me like he wanted to say something. That night he knocked on my door and told me something I should have paid closer attention to. He might still be alive. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The morning after Mrs. Curtis's arrest, I stood at my kitchen window watching the yellow crime scene tape flutter in the wind around her house. My coffee got cold in my hands while I kept trying to remember what Cooper had said that night at my door. His face kept coming back to me, pale and scared. his eyes darting back toward his house every few seconds. He'd said something important, but the exact words stayed just out of reach, like trying to grab smoke. I could see his mouth moving in my memory, but couldn't hear the words clearly. The phone rang and made me jump, spilling coffee on my shirt. Detective Ridley introduced himself properly this time and said he needed to schedule a formal interview at the station. He warned me that news vans were already on their way to our street, and I should avoid talking to any reporters. He said they'd twist anything I said to make a better story, and it could hurt the investigation. I promised to stay quiet, and we set up a time for tomorrow morning at 9. After hanging up, I noticed the first van pulling up outside, its satellite dish already extending into the air. I closed all my curtains and turned off the porch light even though it was still daytime. That night I couldn't sleep and just lay there staring at the ceiling while Cooper's voice kept echoing in my head. Something about checking something, but then the rest would dissolve before I could grab onto it. The guilt of not paying attention when he needed me made my chest feel tight and heavy. I kept thinking about how scared he'd looked and how I'd been too tired or distracted to really listen. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and grabbed my notebook from the nightstand. I started writing down every fragment I could remember from that conversation with Cooper, trying different word combinations to see what felt right. Check the something, look at the something, find the something. Each attempt felt close but not quite right, like when you know a word but can't quite remember it. I filled 3 pages with possibilities, but nothing clicked completely. My brother showed up the next day without calling first, just walked in with his spare key and a bag of groceries. He insisted I shouldn't be alone while dealing with all this trauma, and wanted me to pack a bag and stay at his place. I told him I needed to be here in case Cooper somehow came back or tried to reach me. He didn't argue but said he was staying for dinner at least, and started cooking while I sat at the table feeling useless. By day 3, the street was packed with news vans, and reporters were knocking on doors trying to get interviews. Neighbors stood in small groups on the sidewalk, pointing at the Curtis house and whispering their theories about what really happened. Someone pointed directly at my house, and I saw a reporter start walking toward my door. I quickly closed the curtains and went to sit in the back bedroom where no one could see me. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick at the thought of being questioned on camera. That evening, I decided to go through my phone looking for any photos or messages from around the time Cooper disappeared. I scrolled back through months of random pictures until I found one of him shooting baskets in their driveway from about 6 weeks ago. He was wearing his league jersey, and I could see the number 17 clearly on the back. Something about that jersey triggered another piece of memory, and I sat up straighter on the couch. Cooper had mentioned something about a flyer when he came to my door that night. I ran to the kitchen and started tearing through my recycling bin, then dumped out my entire junk drawer onto the counter. Papers and random items scattered everywhere, but I knew I'd kept something important without remembering what it was. I searched through old receipts and takeout menus and warranty cards until my fingers were black with newsprint. The next morning, I opened my laptop and typed up a detailed timeline of everything I'd observed at the Curtis house over the past few months. Every strange delivery, every odd smell, every time I'd seen or not seen family members. I included approximate dates and times where I could remember them and noted which things I'd photographed or written down. I attached the document to an email for Detective Ridley and explained I was still working on remembering Cooper's exact words. I promised to contact him immediately if I recalled anything more specific. Within an hour, he'd responded thanking me for the organized information and asking me to keep our communication strictly confidential. He said he would personally review any tips or memories I sent and assured me that finding Cooper alive was their absolute top priority right now. The way he emphasized alive made my stomach twist because it meant they were genuinely worried he might not be. That night, I woke up at 3 a.m. gasping for air with my shirt soaked in sweat and my heart pounding, so hard I thought I was having a heart attack. The dream had been about those tarps in the shed, except this time when I looked through the crack, Cooper's face was staring back at me from under the plastic. I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I couldn't catch my breath properly. I sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes doing the breathing exercises I'd Googled on my phone until my heart rate finally slowed down enough that I didn't feel like I was dying. When the doctor's office opened at 8, I was already in the parking lot waiting, and told the receptionist I needed an urgent appointment for anxiety. She got me in that afternoon, and I sat in the waiting room filling out forms about my symptoms while trying not to think about what might have happened to Cooper. The doctor asked what triggered the anxiety, and I told her about finding bodies next door and the poisoned cookies Mrs. Curtis had given me. She immediately ordered blood work and made notes in my file about the cookie incident while I described the dizziness and nausea I'd felt that night. The nurse drew 3 vials of blood, and the doctor said she'd rush the toxicology screen to document any chemical exposure for the police investigation. 2 days later, the results came back, showing traces of something called ethylene glycol, which the doctor explained was basically antifreeze and could definitely cause those symptoms. She printed out the full report for me to give to the detective and wrote a referral for a therapist who specialized in trauma. That evening, I had to walk past the Curtis house to get my mail, and my whole body went rigid the second I crossed their property line, even though the police tape was gone and the chemical smell had faded. My shoulders hunched up and my breathing got shallow, and I practically ran back to my house once I grabbed the mail. The therapist appointment wasn't for another week, but I called and left a message asking if they had any cancellations because I was having physical reactions just walking past the house. The HOA president sent an email that weekend about an emergency meeting to discuss neighborhood safety, and I figured I should go since everyone would be talking about what happened anyway. The meeting was at the community center, and every chair was filled with neighbors I'd never seen at a regular HOA meeting before. People kept turning to stare at me and whispering to each other, and I heard someone say my name followed by, "Should have called the police sooner." The HOA president started talking about property values and installing security cameras, and someone stood up and said we needed to discuss why I hadn't reported the suspicious activity earlier. More people started nodding and agreeing, and my face got hot as everyone turned to look at me expecting an answer. I stood up and walked straight out the door without saying anything because I knew whatever I said would just make them angrier. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and realized I'd been so caught up in my own trauma that I hadn't really thought about Cooper as an actual person who might need help right now. I kept picturing him scared and alone somewhere, while I was worried about property values and anxiety attacks, and I felt sick about how selfish I'd been. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on that night he'd come to my door and what exactly he'd tried to tell me. His voice suddenly came back clear as day, saying, "Check the flyer," before something had cut him off and he'd run back home. I jumped out of bed and ran to the kitchen where I dumped my entire junk drawer onto the table, sending batteries and rubber bands and old receipts scattering everywhere. I sorted through expired coupons and takeout menus and instruction manuals until my fingers were black with newsprint, but I couldn't find any flyer. Then I remembered the recycling bin in the garage and dragged it into the kitchen, dumping everything onto the floor. At the bottom of the pile under some old magazines, I found a crumpled yellow basketball league flyer with the edges torn and coffee stains on one corner. My hands shook as I smoothed it out on the table and saw phone numbers scribbled on the back in messy handwriting that looked like Cooper's. I took photos with my phone, being careful not to smudge the writing, then sealed the flyer in a plastic bag to preserve any fingerprints. I went back through my phone photos from the past few months, looking for anything else I might have missed. In one photo from 6 weeks ago I'd taken of a package delivery truck blocking my driveway, you could see the Curtis porch in the background with boxes stacked by their door. I zoomed in as far as my phone would let me and could barely make out a logo on one of the shipping labels that said Industrial Storage Solutions, with part of an address visible. I took a screenshot and tried some photo editing apps to enhance the image until I could read most of the company name and city. The next morning, I called the first number on the basketball flyer, which turned out to be the league office, and asked about a player who'd stopped showing up mid-season. The woman who answered said she couldn't give out player information, but transferred me to the coach, who sounded concerned when I mentioned this was related to a police investigation. He confirmed a player he called C had been on the team, but stopped coming to practices about 7 weeks ago, which matched when Cooper disappeared. He said the kid was really talented and seemed to love playing, but had gotten more and more anxious at practices before he stopped showing up completely. I thanked him and immediately forwarded all the information to Detective Ridley, including the photos of the flyer and the storage company logo, along with what the coach had told me. Within an hour, Ridley emailed back saying this was exactly the kind of concrete lead they needed, and he was already working on warrants for the storage facility and subpoenas for the league's registration records. That evening, while I was heating up leftover pasta, Doug from 2 houses down knocked on my door holding his tablet. He shifted his weight from foot to foot and kept looking back at the street like he was nervous about being seen. I let him in, and he immediately started swiping through his Ring doorbell app until he found a specific date. The screen showed grainy night footage of my front porch from about 7 weeks ago. A figure I recognized as Cooper walked up to my door carrying something small in his hands. He kept turning around to check the street before setting whatever it was down by my doormat. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., which explained why I'd been asleep when he came by. Doug zoomed in on Cooper's face, and we could see his mouth moving like he was talking to himself or practicing what to say. I asked Doug if his camera recorded audio, and he nodded while pulling out a pair of expensive headphones from his jacket pocket. We plugged them into the tablet, and I adjusted the volume while Doug replayed the video from the beginning. Through the static, I could barely make out Cooper's voice saying something about his aunt. Doug grabbed his phone and opened an audio app that cleaned up background noise. We transferred the file and ran it through the filter, which took a few minutes of processing. The enhanced version was much clearer, and I heard Cooper say, "If she asks, I went to Aunt Sarah's inn," before a car door slammed somewhere nearby, cutting off the rest. My stomach twisted as I realized Cooper had been trying to give me a fake story to tell his mother if she questioned me. He'd been planning his escape and wanted to protect me from getting involved. Doug made a copy of the video file and sent it to my phone while I texted Detective Ridley about this new evidence. Within 10 minutes, Ridley called back asking for the full footage, which Doug emailed directly from his Ring account. The detective said he'd start checking all of Mrs. Curtis's relatives immediately to verify if any aunt named Sarah existed. I spent the rest of that night going through my own security camera footage, but mine only covered the driveway, not the front door. The next day, Detective Ridley called to update me on his search through Mrs. Curtis's family records. He'd contacted 6 different relatives, including 2 aunts, but neither was named Sarah, and none had seen Cooper in months. The aunt story was definitely fake, which meant Cooper had planned ahead and created a false trail on purpose. While I was processing this information, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The basketball coach from the league introduced himself and said he'd been thinking more about the missing player. Something strange had come up when he checked the registration forms from that season. The kid had been registered under a different last name than Curtis, but the jersey number matched what I'd described. He'd scanned the form and was emailing it to me right now if I wanted to check it. I opened the attachment on my laptop and saw Cooper's photo next to registration info that listed him as Cooper Mitchell. The contact section had an email address instead of a phone number, which seemed unusual for a youth league. I thanked the coach and immediately forwarded everything to Detective Ridley, who said this was exactly the break they needed. Looking at the jersey number on the form triggered something in my memory about Cooper's habits. He'd always worn number 23 and used it in everything, like his gaming username and social media handles. I opened Facebook and started searching for variations of Cooper 23 and CM 23 and other combinations. After 20 minutes of scrolling, I found an Instagram account called Coop Mitch 23 that had gone private the same week he disappeared. The profile photo was a basketball which matched his interests perfectly. I took screenshots of everything and noticed the account had 47 followers, which meant people knew this profile existed. That night, I sat at my computer staring at the email address from the registration form for a long time. I typed and deleted a dozen different messages before settling on something simple and safe. I wrote that I was worried about him and just wanted to know he was okay. I didn't mention his mother or the police or anything that might scare him away. I added that I was here if he needed help and hit send before I could change my mind again. The message showed as delivered but not read, which at least meant the account was still active somewhere. I forwarded the email address to Detective Ridley, who called within minutes to say he was already working on warrants. He explained they'd need court approval to access the email provider's records, including login locations and IP addresses. He sounded more hopeful than he had in days, but warned me these legal processes could take time. He didn't want me getting my hopes up about finding Cooper quickly, even with this new lead. 2 days later, while I was grocery shopping, my phone started buzzing with texts from neighbors I barely knew. Someone sent me a link to a news article with the headline, "Neighbor says she always suspected something wrong." The article quoted me saying things I'd never said about always knowing Mrs. Curtis was dangerous. My actual words had been twisted to make it sound like I'd ignored obvious warning signs for months. The comment section was full of angry people asking why I hadn't called police sooner if I'd suspected something. My Facebook messages filled up with strangers calling me negligent and saying I could have saved lives by speaking up. I turned off my phone and left my groceries in the cart and drove straight home, where I locked the door and closed all the curtains. I didn't respond to any of the messages or try to correct the story because I knew that would just make things worse. My brother called that evening after seeing the article and said I needed to get away from the house for a while. He insisted I pack a bag and stay at his apartment where I could sleep without seeing crime scene tape through my window. I kept refusing until he actually drove over and practically dragged me to his car. His apartment was across town in a quiet complex where nobody knew about the Curtis case. I took a hot shower and changed into clean clothes that didn't smell like the chemicals still lingering in my neighborhood. That night I actually slept for 5 straight hours without waking up in a panic, which felt like a miracle. The next morning, I drove to the urgent care clinic near my house to deal with something I'd been putting off. I needed official medical records from my visit after eating Mrs. Curtis's poisoned cookie weeks ago. The receptionist found my file and printed out the visit summary while I waited in the lobby. The report showed my symptoms and test results, including evidence of low-level toxin exposure in my blood work. The doctor had noted it was consistent with certain industrial chemicals, but not enough to cause permanent damage. I paid for certified copies of everything and carefully filed them in a folder with all my other documentation about the case. I scanned the medical report into my computer and attached it to an email for Detective Ridley that afternoon. He called me back within an hour and said the toxin evidence helped show how Mrs. Curtis tried to keep people quiet when they got too close to her secrets. The next morning, my phone rang, and a woman introduced herself as Assistant District Attorney Yvonne Langley, who needed to talk to me about being a witness if this went to trial. She drove to my house that afternoon in a dark blue sedan and sat at my kitchen table with a thick folder full of papers. She explained that I'd probably need to testify about what I saw and documented over the months before Mrs. Curtis got arrested. Her voice stayed calm and professional, but she smiled when I offered her coffee and said she understood this whole thing must be really hard for me. I told her I'd testify if they needed me to, but I didn't want to talk to reporters or have my name all over the news anymore. She nodded and wrote something in her notebook and promised they'd protect my privacy as much as possible during the legal stuff. 2 days later, Detective Ridley called with news that made my stomach drop. They'd found the storage unit Mrs. Curtis had been renting under a fake name, and inside were more chemicals, plus Cooper's old backpack with his transit card still in the front pocket. But Cooper himself wasn't there, and hadn't been for weeks based on the dust patterns. The transit card data showed he'd been using it regularly, though, taking buses to the downtown area near where all the youth services and shelters were located. Detective Ridley said they were checking with every shelter and drop-in center, but being careful not to scare Cooper into running if he was hiding there. The next afternoon, a woman named Catherine Pollard from Child Protective Services knocked on my door. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and carried a worn leather bag stuffed with folders. We sat in my living room while she asked me questions about Cooper from before everything happened. What did he like to do? Where did he hang out? Who were his friends? What made him laugh or get excited? I told her about the basketball games in their driveway and how he'd practice free throws for hours, even when it got dark. She wrote everything down and then asked me not to post anything on social media or talk to reporters about Cooper being missing. She explained that too much attention could make him go deeper into hiding or put him at risk if the wrong people found out a kid was alone out there. I spent the whole next afternoon going through my memories and writing down everything I could remember about Cooper's daily routines. The convenience store where he'd buy energy drinks after school, the park where older kids played pickup basketball games, the library where he'd sometimes do homework. I emailed the list to Detective Ridley, who said he'd use it to make a map of places Cooper might go for food or somewhere safe to sleep. 3 days passed with no news until Detective Ridley called to say a shelter coordinator named Aaliyah Singh had contacted them. She ran a youth drop-in center downtown and had noticed a teenager who looked like Cooper coming in for meals over the past couple weeks. He never stayed long and always sat at a table near the emergency exit where he could watch everyone who came in. Aaliyah had kept quiet about it because she didn't want to spook him, but when she saw the missing person report, she knew she had to call. Detective Ridley said they were putting together a careful plan to approach Cooper without making him run. Catherine from CPS would go to the shelter without any police officers at first, since uniforms might scare him. They wanted Cooper to feel safe enough to talk, instead of taking off into the city, where they might lose him for good. The whole team spent hours planning exactly how to handle it if Cooper showed up at the shelter again. Catherine pulled me aside and asked if I'd be willing to wait at the shelter as someone Cooper might recognize and trust. My stomach twisted into knots, but I said yes right away, because this kid needed to see a familiar face after everything he'd been through. The next afternoon, I drove downtown to the drop-in center and parked across the street where I could watch the entrance without being too obvious. Catherine was already inside with Aaliyah, while 2 other social workers waited in a van nearby, just in case Cooper tried to run. Around 3 o'clock, I saw him walking up the sidewalk wearing the same basketball shorts I remembered from months ago, but they hung loose on his skinny frame now. He pushed through the door and froze when he noticed the adults watching him differently than usual. I stepped into the doorway and called out Coop, which was what the other kids on the team used to call him. His eyes went huge when he saw me, and for a second I thought he might bolt, but then his whole body seemed to sag with relief. Catherine moved toward him real slow with her hands where he could see them and told him nobody was mad and he wasn't in any trouble. She kept her voice soft and said he got to decide what happened next and nobody would force him to do anything. Cooper's shoulders dropped a little, and he looked between me and Catherine like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. After a few minutes of Catherine explaining that she just wanted to make sure he was safe, Cooper finally nodded, but said he'd only come with them if I stayed where he could see me. I told him I'd wait in the lobby as long as he needed, and gave him a small wave to show I meant it. They took him to an office with big windows facing the lobby, and I sat on a hard plastic chair where Cooper could check on me. For 3 hours, I sat there scrolling through my phone and texting updates to my brother while doing those breathing exercises my therapist taught me when my thoughts started spinning out of control. Every 10 or 15 minutes, I'd look up and see Cooper's face pressed against the window, making sure I hadn't left. Around 6 o'clock, Catherine finally came out looking tired but relieved. She confirmed it was definitely Cooper and said he was skinny and worn out, but didn't seem to have any serious injuries or medical problems. My eyes got watery, and I had to look away for a second because the relief hit me harder than I expected. She explained they were taking him to a safe house for the night and would start the formal process tomorrow, but wanted me to know he was okay. The next morning, Catherine called and said Cooper had started talking about what happened. He told her he'd been going through his mom's desk looking for money when he found these journals filled with detailed notes about her experiments. The pages described things that made him realize those packages weren't just gardening supplies, and the smell wasn't fertilizer. That's when he knew he had to get out and tried to warn me that night, but got too scared to say everything. The guilt slammed into me like a punch to the gut, because if I'd just listened better, maybe he wouldn't have been alone on the streets for weeks. Cooper explained that after leaving my door, he grabbed some clothes and the cash he'd found, then hid in their storage unit for 2 nights. But he knew his mom would check there eventually, so he started riding buses all night and hanging out at the library during the day. He'd been living like that for weeks, too scared his mother would find him, or that nobody would believe what he said about her. My chest got tight thinking about this kid sleeping on buses and eating at shelters while we all assumed he was safe with relatives. Detective Ridley showed up that afternoon to take Cooper's official statement with Catherine sitting right beside him for support. They set up in a special interview room designed for kids with soft chairs and calming colors on the walls. I waited in the hallway, even though I wanted to hear everything, because Cooper needed to feel safe enough to tell his story without worrying about what I thought. Through the small window, I could see Detective Ridley writing notes while being real careful not to interrupt or ask questions that might put words in Cooper's mouth. The interview went on for almost 2 hours with Catherine occasionally putting her hand on Cooper's shoulder when he got upset. Later that week, Yvonne Langley from the district attorney's office asked me to come in for a meeting about what would happen next. She laid out this whole timeline of protective orders that would keep Mrs. Curtis away from Cooper and grand jury proceedings that would happen over the next few months. The stack of papers she showed me made my head spin because I hadn't realized how long and complicated the legal stuff would be. She explained I'd probably have to testify at least twice, once for the grand jury, and again at the actual trial if Mrs. Curtis didn't take a plea deal. The whole process could take 6 months to a year, which felt overwhelming, but Yvonne assured me they'd prep me for everything, and I wouldn't have to face Mrs. Curtis directly in court. The next morning, I turned on the news while making coffee and nearly dropped my mug when they announced more victims had been found at other locations connected to Mrs. Curtis. The reporter didn't name them, but mentioned families were being notified, and my stomach churned thinking about those phone calls while also feeling relief that Cooper had made it out alive. 3 days later, I sat in a small office across from a therapist my doctor had recommended, my hands gripping the armrests while I described the nightmares and the way my body tensed up whenever I heard digging sounds. She gave me breathing exercises to practice and helped me identify what set off my panic attacks like chemical smells and the sound of heavy packages being dragged. Every Tuesday at 4, I went back to her office, and slowly the exercises started working, letting me sleep for longer stretches without waking up, gasping. The HOA called another meeting 2 weeks after that, and this time when people started pointing fingers about who should have noticed sooner, I stood up and suggested we focus on practical stuff, like installing better streetlights and organizing a neighborhood watch program. Several people nodded and started talking about motion sensors and security cameras instead of blame, which made the whole meeting way more productive than the last one. Catherine called me the following week to let me know Cooper had been placed with relatives in another state who'd been thoroughly checked out by CPS. She said he'd asked her to thank me for waiting in that shelter lobby and for not giving up on finding him, even though he couldn't bring himself to reach out directly yet. The knowledge that he was safe with family who cared about him felt good, even though it hurt knowing our neighborhood had scared him so badly he couldn't stay anywhere near here. Detective Ridley stopped by my house a few days later, carrying my notebook in an evidence bag, explaining they'd scanned every page for the case files and wanted to return the original to me. He thanked me for documenting everything so carefully, since my notes helped them establish timelines for when certain victims had gone missing and when the chemical purchases had started. I took the notebook back and felt quietly proud that my habit of writing everything down had actually helped build the case against her. The following Monday, Yvonne called to update me that the court had ordered Mrs. Curtis to undergo a full psychiatric evaluation, and she'd been moved to a secure mental health facility while awaiting trial. She explained this was standard procedure in cases like this, but it felt weird thinking of Mrs. Curtis as mentally ill instead of just evil, though Yvonne reminded me that the two weren't mutually exclusive. That same week, the local paper ran a correction after the prosecutor's office held an official briefing, clearing up the earlier stories that had misquoted me, as saying I'd always suspected something was wrong. The online comments calling me negligent slowed down after that, though I still avoided reading anything about the case on social media. One night I couldn't stand lying in bed with my back against the wall I'd shared with the Curtis house, so I got up and spent 3 hours moving all my furniture around until my bed faced the opposite direction. It was a small change, but it helped me feel more in control of my own space and less like I was still connected to that house of horrors next door. 7 weeks after the whole nightmare started, I woke up one morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night without any bad dreams or panic attacks. I wrote it down in my journal with the date circled, treating it like the victory it was after weeks of broken sleep and anxiety medication. Aaliyah from the shelter called me that afternoon to ask if I'd be willing to speak at a community forum they were organizing about recognizing warning signs of abuse and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. My hands got sweaty just thinking about talking in front of people, but I agreed because maybe sharing what I'd noticed could help someone else speak up before things got as bad as they had with the Curtis family. The forum was held at the community center downtown, and I kept my part short, just explaining how I'd noticed changes in Cooper's behavior and the importance of documenting anything suspicious, even if you're not sure it means anything yet. People asked a few questions afterward, and I answered as best I could without getting into the gruesome details, focusing on practical advice about keeping records and trusting that feeling when something doesn't seem right. 3 weeks later, the mailman knocked on my door with a certified letter that needed my signature. The return address showed CPS, and my hands shook a little as I signed for it. Inside was an official form about Cooper's placement status and a small folded note in his handwriting. He wrote that he was doing okay and had joined a basketball team at his new school. He thanked me for trying to help and said maybe someday he could explain everything properly. I sat at my kitchen table reading those few lines over and over while tears rolled down my face. The kid was playing basketball again, and that simple fact made everything else feel worth it. My brother called that afternoon to check on me and said he was coming over the next day with supplies. He showed up with a truck full of motion sensor lights and spent the whole afternoon drilling and wiring them around my property. We worked mostly in silence except for him asking where I wanted each light positioned. After we finished, he grilled burgers on my back patio and we ate dinner watching the sun go down. He didn't ask about the case or Cooper or anything heavy. We just sat there eating and watching the new lights click on as darkness fell. The next morning, Yvonne called to remind me about the grand jury hearing scheduled for that Thursday. She explained I'd just answer factual questions about what I observed and documented. The prosecutor would guide me through everything, and I wouldn't face any cross-examination. I wrote down all her instructions about where to go and what to bring. Thursday came too fast, and I found myself sitting outside a courtroom in my only suit. They called me in after lunch, and I spent 2 hours answering questions about dates and times and observations. The prosecutor showed my photos and notebook entries on a screen while I confirmed when I took them. Some jury members took notes while others just watched me carefully. I kept my answers short and stuck to facts without adding opinions or theories. When they finished, the prosecutor thanked me and said I'd done great. Yvonne met me in the hallway afterward and confirmed the grand jury would definitely return an indictment. She explained the actual trial wouldn't start for at least 3 months due to court schedules and pretrial motions. I asked if I'd need to testify again, and she said probably not unless something unexpected came up. The defense might want to depose me, but she'd handle all that coordination. I felt relief knowing my main role was basically done. 2 weeks later, someone organized a neighborhood vigil for all the victims in the park down the street. People brought candles and flowers and photos of loved ones who'd gone missing over the years. I walked over with a small bunch of roses and found a spot near the back. The organizer read names while people lit candles for each victim. Nobody made speeches or tried to make sense of what happened. We just stood there in the dark, holding our candles and sharing the weight of grief. I left my roses at the memorial they'd set up and walked home feeling less alone. The following weekend, I spread all my documentation across the dining room table to get organized. I made 3 complete copies of everything, including photos and notes and timelines. One set went to Yvonne for the official case file, and one went into my safety deposit box. The originals I put in a filing cabinet with labels for quick reference if needed. It took most of Saturday, but having everything systematized made me feel more in control. I wasn't actively investigating anymore, but supporting the legal process properly. Monday morning, I took my coffee out to the front porch like I'd started doing again recently. Down the street, some kids had set up a portable basketball hoop in a driveway. They were playing 2-on-2 and trash-talking each other between shots. One kid tried a fancy move and completely missed the basket, which made everyone laugh. I sat there watching them play and realized this was the first time I'd seen kids playing basketball on our street since everything happened. The sound of the ball bouncing on concrete didn't make my chest tight anymore. Life was slowly filling back in around the empty space next door. The Curtis house still sat there wrapped in police tape, but it didn't dominate the whole neighborhood anymore. Cooper was safe with relatives who cared about him and had basketball back in his life. Mrs. Curtis was locked up where she couldn't hurt anyone else ever again. The legal system was grinding forward toward justice for all her victims. And me, I was learning to live with what happened without letting it control every moment. The nightmares still came sometimes, and certain smells made me anxious. But I could sleep through most nights now and eat regular meals and have normal conversations with people. The scars from this whole nightmare would always be there, but they weren't running my life anymore. I was genuinely okay with where things had landed after everything we'd all been through. Okay, that was a lot for one night. I'm grabbing a snack and reading your comments. Subscribe and I'll see you on the next chapter.